I say at the start that Lisa Lowe has written the sort of paper that I would like to write. And I've written the sort of paper that only I can write. So, you know, in between those two possibilities, I can try and oscillate and find something useful to say. For the most part, I'm not going to speak directly to the paper. I'm going to try and contextualize the paper, trying to be mindful of some of the things which have been said. I was going to say over the last few days, it feels like the last few days, yesterday, in the conference, which have influenced me and shifted some of my thinking about exposition and the way to raise some conceptual questions. But the other thing to say is that in talking in relation to Lisa's paper, I think that I'm in a fortunate position to feel as if I'm possibly on the right terrain as to the importance and the necessity of rethinking the questions of race and racism through questions of politics and epistemology simultaneously. And in saying that, then that means that we have to think seriously about conceptuality. So the first question I want to foreground, just before I get into the paper, is the question of conceptuality as an inheritance and conceptuality as a heritage. Now we seem to be in a position where some kind of negotiation between those two modalities becomes particularly important around the question of race, racism, racialization. I want to pose those terms because posing the terms race, racism, racialization, in relation to any of those terms as concepts, are we thinking in terms of a heritage or are we thinking in terms of an inheritance? Let me explain what I mean by that. I was trying to think yesterday when I was listening to Jacques Derrida, who I admire greatly, and was finding it quite remarkable that deconstruction all the time was really about an interrogation of racism. I must have missed that one. But I could, you know, I could see the point that he's trying. I could see the point that he's trying to make. But it made me think that what is the relationship of deconstruction to decolonization, which is to say that deconstruction, in order for it to have any particular kind of purchase on the conceptuality as a heritage or an inheritance of race, racism, or racialization, needs to be involved in a double gesture. It needs to be involved with some kind of intervention, which is marked by the notion of decolonization. And I say decolonization because, like deconstruction, it has as its focus, if you like, the attempt to mark some kind of center, some kind of hegemonic imperium, or some kind of hegemonic foundation, and to unravel that, to unravel it in such a way as to open up the field of, shall we say, undecidability, where we can then begin to make interventions around notions of an alternative. Now, whereas deconstruction may work on the field of conceptuality, as it were, decolonization works on the field of imperium. And it seems to me that those two interventions, as a double gesture, need to be brought into relationship with each other. So having said that, if we are framing things motivated by the double gesture of decolonization and deconstruction, it raises implications for how we want to engage conceptually with many of the issues that we've been speaking about. Race, racialization, racism. The terms which frame the conference, which seem to slip by us without anything such as a remark quite often. What would be a decolonized notion of racialization? What would be a decolonized notion of racism? What would be a decolonized notion of race? Now, I pose those questions in a stark way because it seems to me that much of the work that we're engaging with requires us to have an answer to that question. Why am I saying it in that way? Well, if we begin to think about how those kinds of concepts are marked out, they're marked out in a history and in a formation, the greater part of which was not marking them out in any critical kind of way. We're now on the threshold, we're in the post-colonial era, the era of so-called formal decolonization. And yet we're still grappling with those kinds of concepts. To grapple with them as a heritage would be to grapple with them as if those concepts are outside of decolonization. But to grapple with them as we must as an inheritance means that we have to also inherit the incompletions or the failures of decolonization. We have to have now a concept of decolonization which is able to account for the persistence of those concepts and the ways in which now we have to conceptualize their conceptuality. And I want to take one of those concepts, racialization. Racism and politics. I'm still taking racialization. So racism and politics. I want to say something about that as well. In what sense is racism outside of politics? In what sense can racism ever be outside of politics? And I want to answer that question because it will open up the possibility, the space, the conceptual space for me to say something about racialization. If we think about the concept of racism, one of the things that we do know that right up until the middle of the 20th century, in anti-colonial writings, anti-colonial activities, there isn't a mobilization against racism. There isn't. There's a mobilization against slavery, there's a mobilization against coloniality, that kind of architecture of empire in various different places is all of a piece. But there isn't a separable conceptualization of racism. There isn't. It's not that something that we would call racism now was not operating in the colonial theater at the time. It simply wasn't marked out as a distinctive arena of conceptualization. So when does it get marked out as a distinctive arena of conceptualization? It's in the 1930s. It's in the 1930s in the context of a profoundly political situation marked by fascism, or to put this another way, marked by the inability of liberal democracies in various parts of Europe to sustain, if you like, the consent of mass politics or to demonstrate the efficacy of the political in that context. So racism now becomes marked out as a critical concept, a concept of indictment, indicting a particular critique of liberalism which is represented by fascism. Racism as a concept is framed by politics, but it's framed by almost what you might describe as an exceptional form of politics, given that liberalism is the normalizing form. So, is that framing a heritage or an inheritance? If we take it as a heritage, it seems to me that we get stuck with that model that seems to suggest that racism as a concept has to be articulated in relation to that particular historical context of fascism. So therefore it becomes an exceptionalism, it becomes something which is a contaminant of a normalized regime like liberalism, which if it was operating normally wouldn't be contaminated by fascism. If we preserve the concept of racism as a heritage, that's where we end up. But what if we take it as an inheritance, which means inheritance can be disputed, contested, can be mistaken, we have to rethink what is meant by what is inherited? Then we might begin to think of a different conceptual history. It's interesting to note that in the 1930s, there's a set of developments in the United States and the Deep South which go under the name of lynching, which contained within them the sufficient moral outrage and excess and violence to represent the basis for some kind of conceptualization of racism, which is then part of international condemnation. But it didn't, and it wasn't. And in the post-war period, with the institution of the United Nations, what we find is that a number of different political projects now have to reconceptualize their wrongs or their oppressions or their exploitations, which were previously not part of the colonial archive, so to speak, under the rubric of racism. 1951, there's an organization called the Civil Rights Congress that submits a petition to the United Nations. The title of the petition is "We Charge Genocide. Crime against the Negro people by the United States." And if you look at the way in which that petition is framed, what they're doing in effect is saying that we know that there is an international concept of genocide. We know that there is an international concept of racism. You may not have in the past have paid much mind to the experiences that we have had because they were illegitimate. They were not part of international law. Indeed, they couldn't be because international law only recognized nations. But now that you recognize individuals, recognize us as part of this concept. But the problem, of course, is that that concept can only be grasped at that point as a particular heritage from a particular time and place in Europe, not as a colonial inheritance. So many things that could have been conceptualized are not. So I foreground things in that way simply to suggest that there is a great deal to be said about interrogating the conceptuality of the terms race, racism, racialization, if you want to pick those three. It really matters where you start, how you start, and perhaps with which one of those terms you start. And I want to start with racialization. Modernity, all our problems are framed by modernity for some reason. And we have a problem of trying to think about modernity because the way in which modernity has been conceptualized hasn't been conceptualized in such a way as to enable us to think about the things we want to think about. So what do we need to do to modernity? Well, my problem was, and what I'm interested in, is how to derive from modernity itself a conceptualization of race, racialization, racism, which enables us to talk about the very formations that don't get spoken about in the terms of modernity. Let me put this a different kind of way. There is a story told about modernity which says that this is an ever-increasing expansion of rational thought which will take us through an experience of universality in terms of rationality, in terms of institutions. The best name for that is liberalism. Along the way, modernity gets sidetracked by things which are not supposed to be part of modernity. But somehow modernity forms more than a liaison, more than intimate contact, it seemed to me, which sustains those kinds of formations throughout the period. So liberalism and imperialism are gestated within the same kind of temporal and spatial context. But the one gets spoken about as emblematic of modernity and the other doesn't. What kind of conceptuality enables us to think about both of those things together? And both of those things together in such a way that they occupy a conceptual space that hasn't been named. They're not together in an antithetical way, they're together in an organic way. Which is to say, of course, this is a political regime that hasn't been named by the tradition of modernity, but nevertheless is in the tradition of modernity, instituted all the while as a series of traces, often expressed through something to do with race. So race is the instituted trace of a series of assemblages which have produced it. And this is what I want to describe as racialization. The institution of a set of assemblages around a particular kind of intervention, which we will mark as race, but the process, the period over which this intervention has been drawn or marked out, a period of over 300 years, requires us to think about it in terms of racialization. To put this another way, because we are this side of modernity, seeing the ontologization of race as if it is a heritage rather than an inheritance, we don't see the process. We're seeing the product, and we're engaging with the product as if it wasn't part of a process. Part of the product requires us to think about race simply in terms of bodies rather than embodiment. And I want to suggest that racialization speaks to forms of embodiment. Let me demonstrate that in a particular way. Put that conceptualization to one side, and let's say something about the history that might account for this. Racialization as embodiment. Often when people talk about race and modernity, we go straight back to the Enlightenment. Everybody goes straight back to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment's the time period during which we become conscious of the modern. Now for me in the paper, what I tried to do was to say, well, who is the philosopher of modernity? The philosopher of modernity often is Hegel. Some people say it's Kant. I actually think it's Hegel. You can make a case for Kant being a philosopher of racism in a much fully developed way, you know, and Hegel being a philosopher of racialization. This is the way I like to see it. And I think that's, you can see those two kinds of moves worked out in David Goldberg's work on the racial state when he talks about naturalism and historicism. Okay, that's how I read that. Well, what interests me is asking the question as to what is inherited conceptually and uninterrogated by the Enlightenment that might have something to do with racialization, understood as embodiment. And my argument is going to be, although this is not the way I usually make the argument, what is inherited is a concept of Europe, as if Europe was a self-sufficient presence without any process of invention, without any protracted struggle around the meaning of Europe in relation to its construction at the same time of something called non-Europe. Europe is simply seen as present and self-sufficient to itself. And that's inherited by the Enlightenment as a self-legislating subject, or a subject in the Hegelian sense of a self-relation expressible in terms of freedom and reflection. Europe is simply posited like that. Well, if Europe is posited like that, there is a certain difficulty with that positing that we cannot allow to escape our attention, which is that in the positing of Europe, there is, in terms of what we're calling the instituted trace of race, there is the positing of non-Europe at the same time, everywhere. And in the paper, what I've tried to do to try and grapple with this is to organize my thinking around the notion of the chronotope, taken from Mikhail Bakhtin, which is the idea of literature interventions, discourses being organized through tropes of space and time, spatialities, temporalities. And I'm suggesting that in the modernity discourse, the discourse of modernity, the trope of space and time is implicated in the figure of Europe and its construction of non-Europe.
I don't want to give it to me. Go on.
In the construction of non-Europe. I can do this in 5 minutes. So, how I've tried to demonstrate that is to go to Hegel through Habermas. You could go anywhere, but this is just interesting to me. In Hegel, in Habermas's philosophical discourse of modernity, he wants to talk about Hegel as a philosopher of modernity, but at the same time, through that commentary, talk about modernity itself. Now, what is interesting to me, and this is probably where I'll try and finish this, is that Hegel produces a discourse of modernity in which clearly the relationship between an embodiment of Europe as a form of Empyrean, which is what the spirit is doing. You know, you could think about that as a logic of incarnation, but I prefer to think about that as a logic of embodiment. Is also embodying in its representations, in its imputations, in what it attributes, non-Europe. And that's marked out explicitly. It's normalized. Nobody questions that. Nobody calls that race or racialization or racism. And what is interesting to me is that in the period of decolonization, the period in which Habermas is writing his commentary about Hegel, what we find is the normalization going on. So racialization is reproduced, but it's erased at the same time. Okay? So you don't get the references to non-Europe. They're implicitly there, if you like, the ghost of the other, haunted from the knowledges that we have, the text. You don't get that. And what for me that is saying is that because of the experience of decolonization, if we rethink what decolonization must mean now, it must mean we have to account for racialization as normalization and at the same time erasure. Okay? Because anti-colonial movements, decolonization as a way of mobilizing anti-colonial movements, anti-slavery movements, has made an impact. It's made an impact such that certain forms of racialization had to recede out of sight, beyond the discourse, into the forms of otherness, or into the realm of a hauntology of the ontology. Which is why it seems to me today we're always talking about the ways in which racism seems to disappear. Final thing to say then, because of the time, and I know we want to get into some discussion, I try to say something about racialization, focusing on this relationship between Europe and non-Europe, created by the invention of Europe. That, for me, is the mark of the racial. It creates all kinds of bodies, of which our own corporeality is one. But that doesn't say anything about racism, which for me is about the whole governmentalization of racialization, the way in which that kind of instituted social forms of embodiment are then made, if you like, to as the basis of which we institute societies, the way in which we regulate social spaces or build nations.